Hello. In this episode of the Ayers for Architecture podcast, the University of Edinburgh's Richard J. Williams discusses The Expressway World, his brand new book with Polity Press. Richard is an old friend of the podcast, having recorded the first episode in the autumn of 2021. Back then, we spoke about Richard's book on the bearded provocateur Rayner Banham, who, among things, was known for his 1971 book, Los Angeles, The Architecture of Four Ecologies. I guess Expressway World naturally springs from this. While often associated with destruction, severance and car-centric modernity, urban expressways, in some places called motorways, interstates, highways, autobahns, are complex, multifaceted spaces around which a great deal of wider culture has emerged. Movies, novels, music, they are as such, in all senses, cultural. As such, Richard argues, we would be better served to read expressways as social landscapes shaped by individual and collective imaginations.
A is for Architecture, a podcast about architecture, buildings, urban culture and space.
Hello and welcome to another episode of A is for Architecture. I'm talking today to Richard J. Williams. Richard, this is the second time you've been on the podcast. You were the very first episode 4 years ago or something like that.
Honoured.
Then speaking about Rayner Banham, now talking about your new book, The Expressway World, which you published with Polity Press this year. Thank you ever so much. I guess if people want to know about you, they could listen to that, unless there's been substantive changes. What's happened in your life?
No, I'm exactly the same.
So, a professor at Edinburgh.
Yeah. I'm still there. I've been there forever. I'm a professor of contemporary visual cultures, so I teach mostly art historians, but I have a lot of dealings with architecture, and I talk to everybody. Kind of supervise PhDs right across the university.
A nice and short introduction. How did you get to this book? Where does this book, The Expressway World, come from? Because just before we were recording, you were saying, and I thought it was a nice expression, you're amongst a group of people that are writing something like the first draft of this history.
Yes, that sounds very grand now.
It does a bit. No, you
hear
it back.
But what we were talking about, I mean, I was saying that I got into infrastructure, and I now identify with infrastructure and the study of infrastructure, and I think that probably is it. I think this is what I'm going to be doing for the rest of my time. And it has become a really interesting field. There's an awful lot of people doing stuff, and I've been doing stuff on roads. There's people thinking about lots of different kinds of infrastructure, physical or otherwise. So it has become really lively. But I think I just run this session at the SAH, Society of Architectural Historians Conference in Atlanta, and we were thinking there in a slightly more meta way about why we were doing it, and I think we were all thinking that there's quite a lot of sort of descriptive work going on at the moment, and identifying subjects which seem not to have been explored in a historical or cultural way, and in a sense, writing the first draft of history. I think that's the description that the New York Times gave to itself. I think, or anyway, I can't remember.
I see. Yeah, that makes sense.
Or newspapers are the first draft of history. Anybody. So anyway, somebody can dig out the quote. So I'm kind of in that area, and it's become a really lively and rich area for academics in right across the humanities and social sciences. So that there's a kind of academic explanation in terms of how I actually got to this stuff, and how I started to think about roads. Obviously, the last time we talked, 4 years ago, then I'd just done this book on Banham, on Rayner Banham, and that was obviously important, and I felt that there was a big chunk of that it was to do with his experience in Los Angeles, and trying to come to terms with it as this highly auto-centric city that was developing in radically new ways, and his approach to that was really compelling. I still find it compelling. It's like he's discovering something, and he's learning to drive, and he's trying to learn to navigate an entirely new landscape. And that I felt that as I was doing that work, that there was a lot more to be said, and so I wanted to go back to that particular thing. But I also realised that I've been thinking about roads and automobile infrastructure for a long time, and I wrote something back in about 2000 on it. I think I wrote something on the M1. There was an anthology, nice anthology, edited by Joe Kerr and Peter Wallen, that Reaction published, called Autopia, and I did a little piece on that on the M1, and then always meant to come back to it. And I think I've always been thinking about it, always been conscious of the fact that working for so long now in an art history department, that I mean, anecdotally, very few art historians drive. they don't. So,
And almost none drive well, I imagine.
well, yeah, exactly. I mean, Bannon was somebody who learned to drive very late, was an art historian, but actually was a very bad driver as well, as his children told me in some detail. But I was sort of conscious of this, and that working in art history department, and anecdotally, they just don't drive. So there's a kind of, the art historical understanding of the world is often to do with places you can get to by train, and the centres of cities and so on. And I realised that for various reasons, I'd actually spent a lot of my life on the periphery of cities, and in a more auto-centric landscape. And before I was an academic, I had jobs that involved an enormous amount of driving. In fact, I still do drive a lot. My family is all over the place, and I find myself on or in motorway landscapes quite a bit. And it's something that I've just spent a lot of time thinking about. And I suppose I also think that in a society like the one that we live in, that moment of peak road building has, absolutely come to an end. There was a story in the FT earlier this week saying that Britain has only built 65 miles of motorway in the last 10 years, and that was probably an accounting error. So in fact, it's probably built 0 miles of motorway in the last 10 years. And in a way, it's no surprise. I mean, that moment has gone, and other parts of the world maybe are building roads, but we're not. The US is still struggling to do it, and struggles with infrastructure, and it seemed like this whole landscape was, if not disappearing exactly, it was starting to turn into something else. And I think it absolutely will. Next 50 years, it will evolve into something else, and there are all kinds of pressures on roads that are going to make them quite different. So I thought it would be good to look at it, and it was fun.
Yeah, I bet it was fun. I mean,
Mm,
there's a moment in your book where you're describing driving on Glasgow's motorway, which is
mm,
one of my favorites. This sort of insane
mm.
post-war landscape, urban landscape, with slip roads onto the fast
Yeah.
lane, and just bonkers. And
Mm,
remembering quite fondly when my wife was in hospital in the East End of Glasgow for a period of time,
mm,
driving home at 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock in the morning on this completely empty,
mm,
huge piece of public expense, really.
mm,
Feeling very liberated, not by my wife being ill in hospital, obviously, but
mm.
liberated by this thing.
Yeah, well, it can be. I mean, I remember distinctly the first time that I saw the M8, or drove on it, and it was I don't know, early 90s, I think. And I remember just coming into Glasgow from the east and just being staggered by it. I mean, staggered by the scale of it, and the scale of the city at that point, and also the sort of chaos of it.
Yeah.
And I was really impressed. I mean, it was, it's not a pretty landscape at all, but the scale and the ambition, and the consistency of the vision. I mean, all of that stuff. I mean, it's undeniably impressive, and it's not to say that you would do it again
No.
at all, but it's to say that there was there was ambition there that I think we haven't seen since then.
You feel like, because you're an Edinburgh man, and Edinburgh has not done this compared with
Yeah.
Glasgow or Manchester or even London, I suppose.
Mm.
Do you feel that context in some way inversely inflected your approach to this? I guess to look for the problem that is being resolved by the cases that you raise in the book.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's good. A very good question. Yes, it did have a big impact, and I think partly I was writing against Edinburgh in some ways. This has been my home for a long time, and I love the place and whatever. But it's also a place that has a very sort of distinctive sense of what constitutes a good city, and most of the cities that I've worked on and spent time in apart from here have been completely different. They've been big, modern, sprawling cities, and I felt that in some ways what I was doing was a sort of corrective to Edinburgh's sense of what constitutes the good city, and it's not to say that Edinburgh's wrong necessarily, but it's a very unusual place, and it made some very conscious decisions not to build roads. And of course, it tends to anybody you talk to here, they'll often tell you how we got away lightly in the 60s, and we didn't build things, and how wonderful that was. And my response to that is sort of yes, sort of, except we made a choice to spend an hour getting out of the city before we can actually get anywhere. And the circulation is extremely poor. I mean, really poor for such a small place. Whereas Glasgow, you can be in the city centre, and you can be on the motorway, literally in 3 or 4 minutes, and you're out of the city. I mean, they're two distinct visions, but we traded circulation for congestion, and I spent a lot of yesterday cycling in congestion in Edinburgh. It was deeply unpleasant, I have to say, and that's not in the the more curated central parts of the city, but in most of the city, which is the a kind of really congested semi-periphery. It definitely did condition it, and I feel that. Often when I'm in the city, I sort of do want to remind people that there are other kinds of cities out there, and Edinburgh's a rather unusual case, and it has to struggle with these things.
Yeah, for sure. Can you set the scene about expressways and the specific character of this expressway world that you're talking about? As you suggested, it's a kind of cultural moment which is certainly in Western Europe and America and Australia and similar places, nominally the global north, seems to be passing away. Yeah. Certainly it seems to be in a period of substantial decline. But it's not just a technical thing that you're talking about here, is it?
Yeah. No, I think it absolutely is in decline, I think. I mean, and it's in decline partly because these things that I wanted to talk about have reached the end of their design life, or they've reached their capacity or whatever.
What, technically, like they're just not big enough, or they've got concrete cancer or whatever it is.
Yeah, exactly. So if you're in Glasgow at the moment, there's an enormous amount of work going on to keep the M8 going, and it's basically it is in an existential condition. Like how can it go on? And almost all of these things have reached some sort of critical point, and so. So what do I mean by the expressway world? Right. So I mean, the first thing to say is that it's not my term. I borrowed it, and it comes from Marshall Berman and his amazing 1980 book, All That Is Solid Melts Into Air, which many folks on the listening to the podcast will know. And he has a chapter in that. He's describing the condition of modernity from a Marxist perspective, and it's very kind of lively, provocative, thought-provoking, sometimes maddening book. But he has a chapter which he calls the Expressway world, and he's describing the experience of the Cross Bronx Expressway, which Robert Moses, this great sort of multifaceted, all-powerful politician, planner, you name it, in New York, that he pushed through in the 1960s. So Moses did this, and Marshall Berman, this writer, he described the experience of that. This the violence done to the urban landscape. He describes a neighbourhood, his neighbourhood in the Bronx, being literally cleared for this gigantic whatever it is, 12-lane expressway going through the city. That was my starting point, and Berman's take on it. It's a very emotional account of it, and it's full of sort of personal horror. It's like his home's being destroyed, all of that. But that was the starting point. I wanted to just pick examples of that where expressways have been put through the centres of cities. So I wanted the most difficult, disruptive, ugliest, most controversial examples, the ones that were sort of uniquely unpleasant or difficult, and that was really the starting point. And if you start with the Cross Bronx Expressway, then you realise quickly that in especially the northern hemisphere, but also places like Brazil, there's a moment where loads of them are being built. They're elevated, very often sort of big elevated concrete structures. Sometimes they're slightly below grade. Sometimes there's a combination of elevated or tunneled sections. But by and large, you're looking at very large inner city concrete reinforced steel objects, which sort of appear to just punch their way through the existing city with complete disregard for it, and that I think we can all think of examples like that. But once I started to think of that kind of structure, especially the elevated structure, then it was things like in the UK, it's the M8 in Glasgow, it's the Westway, it's the Mancunian Way, it's a lot of Birmingham, Spaghetti Junction, which I didn't talk about, but I could have done. And then beyond that, it's Seoul and the Chongqing Highway. In Brazil, it's the so-called Minhocão or Big Worm. There are countless examples of them, and I think Los Angeles has lots of examples, so I basically just picked the ones I knew, to be honest, and the ones that I felt that I had some kind of purchase on. So it's 60s. It's sort of there's a particular high moment of building, and it's it's mid 60s to early 1970s, and then it sort of comes to an end. But once you start looking at it, you realise how much activity there was at that point.
What is the atmosphere that produces this? Because obviously it's post-war, so there's a lot of this kind of modernization, peripheralization programs going on, urban slum clearances, ostensibly egalitarian kind of ideas, and then the motorways alongside it, which seemed always to me to kind of jump out as a slightly kind of contradictory to that egalitarian idea.
Yeah.
So what generates this desire? What generates this push? And I suppose because you've got these 7 case studies in 7 chapters, 7 case studies across the world, is there a kind of coherent logic that underpins them?
Yeah, I think broadly there is. I think there's a logic of modernization or the look of modernization. This is just simply one of the things you do if you want to look modern. You have a kind of spectacular circulation system that uses a technology that is very much in the ascendant, rather than rail-based technologies. But you have a technology of the private car and the assumption that everyone's going to have a private car. I mean, these may be incorrect assumptions, but there's certainly a global understanding that this represents modernity. If you want to look modern, build something like this, and that's putting it very crudely. But in terms of the, I suppose, northern hemisphere, I think something that is very real is an understanding of the city as being something that ought to be dispersed and polycentric and mobile. And I think there's a concerted attack driven by what is presented as common sense, I think, but a concerted attack on the traditional city, or certainly the 19th century city. And in terms of the MA, I mean, it's very explicit. From the reports on planning of the city and Strathclyde region from 1945, 1946, and so on. I mean, those reports are all about decentralisation and the kind of horror of the slums, the horror of this super dense city centre core, and the motorways are part of that. So there's a very clear understanding in Glasgow. I mean, it's one of the best cases, I think, of that the city needs to be sort of opened out, dispersed, spread out, and it becomes polynucleic. It's connected by a grid of motorways, and people are going to be constantly mobile. And there's even in the 1940s, there's quite a clear sense of the region becoming a kind of leisure-oriented region. And the Abercrombie report on Strathclyde is written in '46, published a couple of years later. I mean, it's very clear about that. So and you see that all over the place. So the motorways are part of this understanding of the city as being something that needs to be opened out, decentralized, depopulated, dispersed, all of that on a mini scale. I've always been fascinated by Milton Keynes. On that, I love Milton Keynes. I do. It's great. But it's an understanding of a city that is it's very small, but the basic assumption is that the centre doesn't really matter. It's a grid. It's a network. People are going to be mobile. They're going to be moving about. They're going to have freedom of choice. And those ideas become very powerful. I mean, in Glasgow, a lot of the reports that I came across in the archives in the Mitchell Library were not just to do with circulation, but there's lots of council minutes about shopping. They're fascinated by shopping. All the councillors are always going on visits to other countries to look at shopping, and it's. So it's all part of that. And again, I'd say that it's this is not necessarily how we want to build cities now, but it's a very distinctive landscape, and I think we need to understand it before it disappears entirely, because a lot of the very rapid changes that have happened in the last 20 years or so have they've had consequences that are not altogether comfortable.
Yeah, I think there's a lot there. I mean, it's really interesting, this idea of the ascent of mobility as a kind of paradigm that we exist within and expect. And I guess pre-individual cars, that idea was like people just didn't think like that. Like
No.
this emancipatory technology, and it has been possibly even more than voting, the most emancipatory thing that's ever happened to human beings. The capacity to get the fuck out of places, away from poverty, away from abuse, away from whatever it is. That's a huge thing. So
it is. I would agree with that. I think it's been an extraordinary technology, and obviously, I think we're now reaching a point where I'm sure we're at peak car or beyond peak car. It's going to, we're moving into an entirely different landscape, and clearly, we're very, I'm acutely aware of what happens if you don't have access to that technology and all of that. Yeah, these are. Yeah, we don't need to sort of explain those things, but I think still I mean, there are emancipatory qualities about it, and the ability to sort of live anywhere and not be tied to geographical distance is when it works is can be extraordinary.
There's even something strange. The M73 extension in Glasgow, when they built that, which wasn't so long ago, it felt qualitatively different, to go back to your kind of experiential quality of the modernization through motorways that happened mid 20th and late 20th century. where the thing becomes, the new motorway is very smooth and it's very high quality,
Yeah.
but it's got these high sidings to it to kind of stop sunlight coming into your eyes, stop you getting distracted, and it becomes this thing that doesn't have a vision. It's a kind of utility for transportation rather than, as you suggest, it's almost poetic.
Yeah. It's interesting. The Scottish Roads Archive. There's two guys who run this. They're very enthusiastic engineers and know everything. I mean, everything there is to know about Glasgow's roads. They really like that one, the M73 and M74. They think this is how it should all have been. The engineering of it was fantastic. So,
I
yeah.
mean, it is pretty good. It is pretty
Right.
good.
Hmm.
You've got these principal case studies, and I'm really interested in this idea of the kind of the changing nature of the city imagination, the city
Yeah.
imaginary.
Hmm.
Going from, I guess, the motorway allows us, the expressway allows us to go from the metropolitan to the,
Hmm.
what is it,
Yeah,
megalopolis? Is that what it is? And
I think.
I'm not referencing that absolutely atrocious recent film, but
No,
uh,
no, I've yet to see it actually. Although everyone says it's so bad, I feel like I have to go and see it. Right, yeah, but it's a kind of megalopolitan imagination,
yeah.
really, something like that. I mean, I'm the scale thing is interesting. I mean, I think I mean, lately, especially during COVID as well, I did an enormous amount of driving just to try and keep my family together, or to make sure we didn't all disappear. And I was sort of routinely driving from here to Leicester, and then quite often on to London. They were often quite complicated journeys, and it did feel like a megalopolis, really. I
Mm,
mean, the UK is it's a network of quite small cities, really. But the motorway system, which I mean turned out to be remarkably efficient. I mean, I could time my journeys almost to within 3 or 4 minutes,
mm,
and very very predictable journeys. But yeah, it often I did start to sort of have a sense of it as being a megalopolis, really,
mm.
which I think a lot of listeners will find horrifying. Like I quite liked it. It made me it made me think of the whole of Britain as being very quite
Coherent.
quite well and quite efficiently urbanized.
Yeah, it certainly is. I mean, if you drive from Manchester, you can almost stay, but for a little gap south
Mm.
of the West Midlands,
Mm.
kind of stay in an urban area. And I was taking the train up to Glasgow just last week, and
Mm.
yeah, from Euston up, kind of
Mm.
never leave it.
That's right. Yeah.
There's a bit in the Lake District, but that's basically a garden. And then
Mm.
there's Dumfries and Galloway, and
Yeah.
that's a bit wild. But other than that, it's more or less. Anyway, it's a fascinating thing. Power dynamics seem to be central to your analysis,
Yeah.
which I
They are.
think is interesting. Could you talk a little bit? What do you mean here?
Yeah. There's a lot about power. Um, I mean, I think a lot of my stuff has been about power in different ways, and architecture and power, and architecture as politics, and all of that. And this book is, a lot of it is about politics, and how power gets exercised through by building infrastructure. There's an anthropologist, Brian Larkin, who's written about infrastructure, and he talks about it in a way that's been quite influential for me. He talks about it as a way of doing politics it's beyond the debating chamber and the ballot box, but it's through building things that you do politics. And I think, and by extension, he also implies that once you build infrastructure, then the politics is also the way that people respond to that, and that there's politics in resistance, and there's politics in use and in habitation, and all of that. So, and I certainly go along with that, and
Mm,
I think around infrastructure, there's all kinds of culture that we're beginning to understand a bit better. But in terms of big politics, then there's a lot of big men in the book. Sometimes there aren't, and there's resistance to that. But there are some quite authoritarian figures. So I mean, Robert Moses in New York is important. He's critical, and is a no question is a visionary figure, but also somebody who does immense damage to bits of the New York landscape, and somebody who has very little regard for the effects of what he's doing. Moses is an important figure, and I read while I was doing research for the book, I read The Power Broker, Robert Caro's amazing biography of Moses. But then there are a bunch of other figures who turned out to be important. So, I mean, so I'm looking at my remind myself who some of the key people. But Brazil. Brazil is really important reference point for me. For this book and other projects as well. But there's Paulo Maluf, who was the prefect of Sao Paulo in the late 60s. He's a really critical figure, somebody who's very close to the military regime of the time, somebody who's very anxious to get things done, and is able through contacts to get stuff done very quickly. So you have these figures who have a lot of energy and they want to do stuff quickly. And so I think you're often looking at projects which are built and conceived and realized in extraordinarily short spaces of time. So Moses is unbelievably energetic, but in Brazil, the case study there, the minhocão, big worm, it's designed and realized basically in 2.5 years, and it's a basically 5-kilometer piece of urban road put through a really tough bit of landscape. And then same thing in Seoul, you've got Park Chung-hee, who's the basically military leader, and has a sort of willing accomplice in a mayor called Kim Hyun-ok, and they likewise do things incredibly quickly. And so there's a few cases like that of I suppose authoritarian power, and authoritarians using roads as a means to express power and to represent power. Do you have that a lot? And then you have curiously some of the case studies are to do with what happens when there's a desire to demolish or get rid of an expressway, and sometimes you have quite authoritarian figures in charge of those processes, which weirdly turn out to be the same kind of processes. So to demolish a 5-kilometer long elevated highway takes the same kind of political skills and power as it does to build a thing in the first place, and sometimes it's the same kinds of people involved. And then in the UK, then it's quite interesting. You don't have individual figures so much, but you have in Glasgow, for example, the Glasgow Corporation. It is the existence of the M8 and the ambition of the plans to reconstruct Glasgow through motorways is a wonderful example of just how powerful the city council was in the post-war period. It's unbelievably powerful and ambitious, and compared to what it is now.
In the case of any of these, and in the cases that you've looked at that weren't expressly authoritarian or dictatorships or juntas or whatever, did you find that the idea of a democratic feedback loop, a kind of participatory democracy, was at play in any of them? I can't imagine that any public has ever sort of voted for this sort of thing.
No, this is right. So there really is in all of these 60s, early 70s cases that democracy is not really present at all. So in the case of the UK projects, then it's planning departments who have an extraordinary amount of power, and they which they clearly don't have anymore. And I think it's the moment where there's a whole lot of resistance to the project of modernisation
Mm.
appears. It's this moment, and it's late 60s really, and it emerges in relation to projects in which, all things being equal, ought to have had more public participation in them.
Mm.
But they were basically, either presented by authoritarian regimes, or in the case of the UK, by planning departments of then powerful city councils, and there's very little democracy involved at all. So it's the moment where resistance emerges, but I think it's well, I mean, that makes it interesting, I think.
Yeah, for sure. That sort of level of paternalism. I don't know if we've ever spoken about this before, but I've wondered, certainly. A podcast that I recorded last week with a scholar called Kenny Coopers,
Oh yeah.
who's been writing about the nature of empire as a process which came home rather than went out. The way that empires were managed became the logic that was then deployed at home. And I've wondered about this kind of idea that Robert Bruce plan for Glasgow kind of thing smacks of colonialism just at home, just on the
Yeah.
people of Glasgow.
Yeah, it is. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, the Bruce report, amazing report, 1945, but basically proposes demolishing the entire city centre.
Mm.
And it's profoundly sort of dispersing, and its understanding of the city. The city ought, has to be dispersed, emptied out, become something else, become a sort of park.
What for? For me, this is all very interesting because it seems to be in each of the cases you've mentioned, seems to be about, increasing mobility, which is to say economizing spaces that are not economized, perhaps emancipatorily including spaces in the democratic or the governance franchise, which are not included, but also transforming the image of the city into a space of leisure and pleasure and
Yeah, yeah. It's I mean, the what for question is a very good question. I mean, I quite often feel that it needs some psychotherapy. It's almost like you need to invoke the language of psychoanalysis or something to understand precisely what's going on. But there's an absolute horror of the Victorian city. I mean, it's and you look at any architectural discourse from the 40s and 50s and in Britain, and just the horror of Victoriana and the industrial city and density and all of that is really palpable. I mean, obviously the architectural review does start to, there's a counter movement that emerges at that point. But it's very strong in say something like the 1946 Abercrombie report, and it's well illustrated, and it's got pictures of really dense, sooty tenements, and presented in a way that is meant to produce revulsion. And I think it's the legacy of the war. It's a sort of I think it's something that we should return to, and we need to sort of remember that moment, because I think all of that reconstruction is incomprehensible without that the understanding of the horror. I mean, I think if you were in sort of left leaning city council grouping like Manchester, then you would know about Engels, and the condition of the working class in England. You would have known about that. And I read that book many times, but it describes the total horror of the industrial city, and I think that has a very powerful legacy. There's a desire to just sweep it away.
yeah. I remember I did a whole bunch of writing around Glasgow's stuff in relation to community resistance to those programs, and obviously people like Jane Jacobs feature in your book as this moment of resistance, and I'd like to come on to like how resistance emerges now, because even though that's a most glorious story and worthy of retelling, I think, in terms of time. But I was struck when I was looking at Abercrombie's work on, say, for example, the Gorbals, which was, to create a logic around its demolition and replacement by RMJM and Basil Spence's tower blocks. There was actually a deceit right at the heart of it, which was around the urban density, where they calculated urban residential density using the back courts in the tenement blocks and divided the area of that by the population and gave you it was complete fabrication. So there was not just this idea that it was horrifying, but it was also that they needed to kind of present to the public imagination.
Yeah, I mean, that's very interesting. I've not done enough work on Glasgow's density to sort of,
Who
to know
would?
that.
Who would?
But well, but density is a very good topic. I mean, it doesn't surprise me in the slightest that's the case. But certainly, yeah, there's definitely, there's a horror of density, isn't there? I think somebody has probably done a PhD thesis on it, but that as a motivating factor in post-war British urbanism is very
Yeah.
important. The idea we have to get out, fresh air, light and space.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and I think for us it comes back to this idea of the expressway as being almost like a technological solution to the back to the land movement. Like
Yeah,
the city is a big wicked place and we
yeah,
must escape.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's that those are the things I think.
The idea of the imaginary, this idea of the expressway as a cultural artifact, and
Yeah,
the way that expressways are documented and presented in media is
mm,
very interesting. And obviously J.G. Ballard's La La Land, but also his book High Rise, which is
yeah,
the other side of it, the
mm,
idea of the horror of the density, the
yeah,
horror of the urban, or Soylent Green, the opening sequences of
mm.
Soylent Green, this idea.
Yeah. Fascinated by all that. I mean, it's a big part of the book.
Yeah. Which do you find is the most compelling? Which has been the most influential, do you feel, on your journey to this kind of work?
Yeah, no, I was thinking about this before we started talking, because there's loads of stuff in a way, and it's difficult to just pull out one or two things. I mean, Ballard, I think, is an inevitable reference point in all of this. So, Concrete Island, Crash, which I don't really like Crash at all. And High Rise, and that trilogy is really important, and not just for the novels themselves, but for the way that people talk about them, and inevitably you have to engage with that stuff. I think for the book, then it was Concrete Island that was the most important one. Whether I like Ballard or not, I don't know. I mean, but I think what was interesting about him was that he had an open-mindedness towards the modern landscape, which is still important. He's sort of saying, what if it's interesting, or this is just a new kind of landscape that we're in. We have to come to terms with it somehow. That as a position is important. I mean, if anything, it's been what people say about Ballard for me that's been more interesting than the novels themselves, which are like very programmatic, and I think they're sort of more interesting as ideas than they are anything else. For the book, there was one interesting thing that he wrote for the AA magazine on motorways, and I mean, God knows what the readers thought of it, but it's this incredibly sort of dark anti-humanist piece, but talking about the importance of motorways, and it's short but really interesting. So I enjoyed that. So Ballard's sort of inevitable, but I mean, in terms of stuff that I thought about a lot. I mean, one thing that made an impression as soon as I saw it. I mean, probably maybe even 50 years ago, was it's the Tarkovsky film Stellaris, the science fiction film, mostly set on a space station, but from 1972. And I mean, it made a huge impression on me the first time I saw it. It was on BBC Two one afternoon, and I'll bring it up because there's this sequence in the opening half hour, which is all on Earth, a wordless sequence where the main character, an ex-astronaut, is being driven around Tokyo on this really elaborate system of expressways, and the sequence goes on and on and on, and it's completely wordless. And sometimes it's seen from the car, sometimes it's seen from behind the car. It's sometimes it's speeded up. A bit of it's in color, a bit of it's in black and white. It's the most amazing hypnotic sequence with a a soundtrack to match. And I've watched that over and over again, and it's really, I don't know, it made a huge impression. And it sort of said something like, what if this landscape is all right, or what if there is something that we can learn from this, or it's beautifully filmed, and it's very good at presenting an idea of a city that is absolutely all about mobility and flow, and it has a sort of hypnotic quality. I think it's brilliant. That's probably the most important thing. I mean, there's any number of movies, of course. I saw Paris, Texas again, the other day for the umpteenth time, and that's great at representing a kind of mobile landscape. I enjoyed that. But I think there was sort of other things. I was in discussion. I didn't meet him in person, but I had a discussion with Michael Moorcock, the science fiction writer, and a few other people in the circle. People who were living in West London in the late 60s and early 70s, and it was a period that I've always been really fascinated by, and it's exactly the moment where the Westway gets punched through West London, and almost as soon as it's built, it develops a whole lot of countercultural activity underneath it. Starting with adventure playgrounds, and there's some of that in the book, but also it becomes a venue for gigs. And I remember seeing, as a sort of slightly dissolute teenager, I remember sort of seeing photographs of bands like Hawkwind and the Pink Fairies sort of playing underneath the motorway, and obviously, and it's this sort of post-apocalyptic landscape, and obviously everyone's having this tremendous time, and somehow the motorway structure frames that really well, and there's something that's produced there. There's a really interesting cultural moment where something is produced in relation to the motorway. It becomes this almost perfect structure for doing a certain kind of countercultural event. And Moorcock was very interesting on that, and also when I talked to Ian Sinclair as well a little bit. I mean, just online, but something really interesting was going on there. So in terms of culture, that it was the knowledge of that sort of stuff was also really important. And I think in the end, my attraction to the Sao Paulo case, the Domínio Kant, is partly driven by that. There's an echo of that countercultural sensibility that you see there.
I read somewhere a while back, or maybe I imagined it or dreamed it, but I think I read it, about the idea of the Los Angeles expressways being actually the correct form of public space for our society, for our culture, insofar as whilst when we look at photographs or films of it, it looks like a giant traffic jam at rush hour. Actually, they're all listening to the radio. They're listening to The Breakfast Club, the most listened to radio show in the world, or something like that. And actually, it's a deeply public space. It's just that we have maintained even whilst we've become megalopolitan
Mm.
or even meta-city-like. We've maintained this kind of fetish for the Parisian metropole, the Italian hill town, hill city. And it's kind of interesting to me that we still struggle with that tension, and that the motor car, in a way, is both the salvation from the tyranny of that,
Mm.
but also represents somehow a kind of debasement of that perfect city,
Mm.
the Kevin Lynch's image of the city.
I would say, yeah. I mean, around the idea of the LA freeway system being a kind of public space. Yeah, I mean, there is it does have something of that quality. I mean, I mean, if it is a public space, it's an extremely perverse one, no question about that.
Yeah.
But it does sort of function like that. I remember, there's just an anecdote. It's not LA, it's Liverpool. But there was a period when I was living in Manchester and working in Liverpool, and some of the time I'd take the train, quite often I'd drive. I could do it then. I could do it door to door in about 45 minutes. And I discovered that if I left, I mean, I'd leave at the same time every day, and I started to recognise the traffic coming in the opposite direction. And it's like everyone, and it became this familiar motorised crowd. I'm not making this up. I mean, I'd see like the same cars at the same point, and I'm sure there must be lots of LA stories like that. And
Yeah.
it's not. I mean, maybe it's an incredibly sort of debased form of public life and probably quite perverse, and we're not saying this is a good thing necessarily, but it does have some public qualities to it, and the urban traffic is a bit like a crowd, and I think I've been to LA a lot over the years, and my experience of driving around there is that there's a lot of flow. There's a lot of fairly sort of satisfactory flow. I mean, the cost in carbon and rubber and all of that. I mean, nobody would start with this as a way to do a public space, but it's as it actually exists. I mean, it does have some genuinely public qualities, I think.
And certainly it prefigures the online world.
Yeah.
The idea of a flow, a public space as a flow rather than a static space of movement.
Yeah, and I think those. I mean, if nothing else, I think it's worth hanging on to qualities like that. Flow is important. I think we have got, in the last few decades, we've got sort of locked into a desire to recreate rather static public spaces, and it's essentially been a sort of reassertion of the 19th century public realm in lots of ways. But and then things like the 15-minute city and so on is a sense that you want to concentrate as much activity, you want to avoid mobility in a sense, and I know I can understand all of that, but equally there are qualities of flow which I think are important to a lot of people. That flow as being in a space of flow for a bit as a transition between one form of existence and another form of existence, between home and. I mean, I've never. I mean, at the moment, I have almost no commute. I mean, I walk 15 minutes to work, but I mean, I wouldn't mind if it was longer. I wouldn't mind if there was a bit of flow.
Your book doesn't advocate for the destruction of the expressway.
No.
But rather a sort of assimilation.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that? How does this assimilation, how have you seen it in the cases that you've done of São Paulo, Seoul, wherever, even in Madrid, which I'm surprised at?
That's right. They're all interesting cases. I think the starting point was I thought that the general the sort of mood that and the desire that you saw it expressed everywhere to the expressway world should be demolished. I mean that it seemed, I thought there was more. It had to be more complex than that, and I think it's become very clear that any demolition projects that have been enormously expensive in terms of financial cost, but also that there's a big carbon cost as well, and let alone what do you actually do with the stuff that you've demolished. And it's an extraordinarily costly thing to do. That's not a reason for not doing it, but it's not going to be a kind of everyday solution. But I became more and more I suppose agreeable or sort of favourable to the idea of somehow coming to terms with the expressway world, having spent a lot of time in São Paulo and looking at this particular case study of the minhocão, the big worm, which through a series of political and other accidents and some activism and just some very ad hoc local arrangements, has become an intermittent park. So it's a 3.5 kilometre long elevated structure in the centre of the city, and for several decades now they close it at night and they close it at weekends, and during those times it just gets used as a park, and you can go running on it, cycling, whatever. It's an extremely conflicted and problematical space. There's no question about that, and it's not clear exactly what its future is. But it's as a park, it's great. I mean, it's at weekends it's just lovely, and I have spent a lot of time on it. I mean, it's like a beach. It's really good, and that has happened with almost no financial investment at all. It's just simply through local legislation and all of that, and it has over decades really rather transformed the area. I have to say, at the same time, it's a very conflicted space. There is São Paulo has a huge homeless problem, and there are, I mean, at several points in the time that I've known this space, there have been hundreds of people living underneath it, and so it basically reproduces all of the inequalities of the Brazilian city. And I think you could reasonably say that this is what's been created on this close the on the upper level at weekends is a very privileged space, and I'm very conscious of that. But at the same time, it shows that just through managing the demand of different constituencies who want something different out of the space, that you can do imaginative things, and it's become a kind of tourist attraction. So that for me is a model. It is very, very imperfect, but I think there's scope to first of all learn to live with these objects. You don't have to demolish them. I think you can civilize them, you can manage them differently, and I think over time the auto world is going to change anyway. We're in this great process of electrification. Maybe autonomy of some kind is going to come in. I mean, who knows? It's changing. We're beyond peak combustion engine car, certainly, and so these things will evolve, and so I would favour just you can live with them, and the cases where there has been really large scale demolition and beautification, they are fraught with difficulties in all sorts of ways, and they often look like environmental projects, and they're not at all. They're completely the reverse.
Good point to finish on. Thank you ever so much, Richard. It was great to hear you talk about the book.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you.
From the sublime to the ridiculous, A.E. Houseman. Into my heart an air that kills from yon far country blows. What are those blue remembered hills? What spires, what farms are those? That is the land of lost content, I see it shining plain. The happy highways where I went and cannot come again. But is it though, Alfred Edward? You can come again if you just want it hard enough. Read Richard to see how it's being done. Thanks to him for taking the time to chat, and to Polity for the PDF of the book. Links to all are in the podcast description as ever. Go get 'em, soldier. And thanks for listening.